Hi, welcome to this week's Soccer 1050 content, where we're going to be looking at the figures of youth, which is largely based on the reading for this week, which I wrote. So I'm going to break it up into three different sections. I'm going to broadly introduce why thinking about the figurative use of youth is important. And then I'm going to go through the different kind of categories that youth are kind of used in figurative ways in different parts of society. So we're going to start with part one, figures of youth. So the broad motivations with this paper are, after doing, youth studies research for such a long time now, I come to notice how the very kind of term youth, the way that it's used and what it's defined as, or the different attitudes towards it, can be quite different depending on where the people are coming from in terms of who's using it. So I kind of started to do a little bit of analysis of some media and some politics discourse and even youth studies itself to kind of draw out the way these things are, the way youth is kind of thought of in different ways and used in different ways. So in previous weeks and in introductory courses, you would have heard about, youth being used symbolically violently in moral panics. And that's certainly kind of one aspect that I'm going to talk about today and the different ways that happens. Young people are quite often the object of moral panics. But more broadly, and that's been one of the kind of objects of youth studies research. But more broadly, even by experts with different motivations and different perspectives and kind of what they want to do with young people, make interventions in their lives to make them better, to educate them or whatever. Even within those kind of expertise areas, there's kind of different ways that the idea of youth is used. And notice there that I said the idea of youth. There's a kind of conceptual difference between youth as a concept and young people, the kind of everyday living and breathing young people in the real world. Youth in that sense is, I think, best I've thought of as a kind of concept to think about that liminal period between child and adulthood, often seen by psychologists as that developmental period. And it's also a key area where there's a bunch of interventions into young people's lives. Now, whether that's kind of the normal everyday stuff about, going to school or going to church or whatever, or going to sporting organisations and different ways that these can shape us in that kind of general socialisation model. But more specifically in youth studies, and particularly for people that experience inequality or marginalisation and discrimination, there tends to be a different set of interventions into young people's lives from the criminal justice system or more kind of the police and things like that. So, and they become then more open to being institutionalized. And then there's a bunch of experts that come into their lives, often with the real, very good motivations of helping them and making their lives better. But this, as we can see with the labeling kind of theory that we've looked at already, that this can then have problematic aspects for those young people as well. So, broad brass tacks here is that when we use the word term youth, people can actually be talking past each other. They could be meaning very different things depending on their theoretical perspective, depending on their methodology, depending on the ontology and epistemology that they're coming from. And this is particularly the case when it comes to expert discourses. So, what are some of the key overlapping differences in how the figure of youth is summoned in the social sciences? So, I'm talking quite generally here, but there's an array of differences between disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, psychology, social work, economics, education, criminology, and so on. Some kind of, I would say, have somewhat of a kind of interventionist attitude towards young people, a kind of missionary zeal in many ways to kind of make them better. Others have a more kind of, I would say, scientific point of view and want to measure their brains and all this kind of stuff. Youth studies tends to want to do their research from the young people's perspective. There's researchers who do qualitative work and quantitative work, and this is, again, will have sometimes figuring ways of the way that youth is different. Qualitative work tends to, as I was just saying, more often than not, use interviews, ethnography, participatory methods to kind of point out the nitty-gritty of young people's lives. Quantitative work does the same, but it often tries to measure things as well, and so then the idea of the young person invoked in that research is different. There's those in youth studies that also kind of draw up their own figures to trace, different ways that youth is invoked in the world, and I'll do some of that later in this. There's different kinds of research done as well. There's applied research and applied research done by what we call stakeholders in the so-called sector to influence policy. And I think many of you studying this course will be looking to get into those areas in your career in the future. And again, this tends to have a slightly different understanding of what youth is, or the lives of young people, than all the other things I'm talking about here. There's also differences in the way we treat young people in research between different collectives, and then when we treat them as individuals, and there's a kind of blurriness that happens between those things as well. And certainly, as youth studies have shown, there's differences in cultural notions, differences between, rural and urban youth, between, different countries, and certainly in different space and time. The kind of attitude of young people in previous generations will be different now. But all these kind of different things that I'm talking about here become kind of bound up and invoked when we use this term. So what I'm kind of arguing here is that while that's inevitable in some ways, words always kind of generalize the thing that they're describing, the object that they're the kind of symbol for. It's important that when we use these terms, or any terms really, in research or in interventions into people's lives, that we understand some of the baggage that we're kind of drawing in and maybe defining with, as opposed to other different ways that other people do it. So in the next couple of sections, what I want to do is essentially paint an incomplete picture of the different ways that youth are invoked in different areas of society. So, and show how these are kind of in a way a feedback loop, what some sociologists call an assemblage that has powerful effects. These kind of different figurizations, different ways that youth are brought into being, how they're governed and exploited, and importantly, influence the way young people are treated or positioned within research itself. Now, the different figures I'm going to point out in the next couple of bits aren't exhaustive. I don't think it's a complete typology, and not really trying to do that. It's just kind of making an intervention here to think about this more clearly. But I hope that if we can consider some of these different aspects, and I'm not the first to do it, there's been a kind of history of considering this these differences throughout youth studies. But I hope we can then draw clearer conceptions of our research objects, help reduce confusion and the possibility that different kinds of experts are talking past each other, and help those engaged in youth studies to be kind of reflexive about the way their own decisions, about their own motivations, about their own attitudes towards things can also be implicated in some of those governmentality processes that Peter Kelly's foundational work has shown out. And for those in the course already have looked at how that can also, we've already looked at the idea of labelling, how our work can also be implicated in those processes of labelling as well. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next section now.